Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. It is Women's History Month, and this month I want to do a few episodes that focus on a very specific topic that to me is around empowerment, and I think that that is right in line with the theme of Women's History Month. But I really want to take a step back and focus on self-love. So self-love is a topic or a word, honestly, a phrase that I generally don't use in session with clients. I generally don't tell people you just have to love yourself. Self-love is so important. Self-worth and self-value and self-esteem, while those things do come up, those topics often come up, I generally don't say those words with my clients because a lot of times it's very superficial. It doesn't really have a lot of meaning behind it. It's very ambiguous, and just saying love yourself to someone doesn't really tell them a lot of what that means. So, like we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, we mentioned that love is action, and we specifically cited 1 Corinthians 13, the scripture that is probably the most commonly used scripture at weddings to talk about what love is. But often when we're talking about that scripture, when we're talking about what love is, we're typically referencing other people. We're typically referencing how we love someone else, how we love a partner, how we love a parent, how we love a family member, how we love a child, how we love God, but we're generally not talking about how we love ourselves. And the more that I think about what do I typically say to women when I'm telling them to love themselves without actually saying those words, what are the things that I say to them? And oftentimes I'm saying things that are very much so in line with that scripture and very much so in line with the concept of loving yourself, but not necessarily using those exact words. So I want to spend a few sessions talking about how do you love yourself in a 1 Corinthians 13 kind of way. So I'm going to pull out several of the different descriptors of love from that scripture and talk about how that applies to loving yourself. So 1 Corinthians 13 gives a very descriptive description of what love is. It says that love is patient, that it is kind, that it is confident and assured. However, it is also humble, it is forgiving, it's considerate of others, it's slow to anger, it protects, it hopes, it perseveres, it rejoices in truth, and it never fails, right? So when we think about all of those qualities and characteristics of love, wouldn't it be amazing if we focused that same energy towards ourselves? So I want to start with that piece of being forgiving. Keeping no record of wrongdoing is what the scripture actually says. I want to talk about that, but I also think that we can't talk about that without also talking about patience and kindness, which I'm going to kind of lump into compassion. And slow to anger will probably also come up in there. So let's start with this forgiving piece. Let's start with this not keeping a record of wrongdoing. A lot of times when we're thinking about loving ourselves, when we're thinking about, this particularly shows up a lot in relationships with other people. Oftentimes our intimate relationships are the things that bring out the gunk and some of the things that we need to work on in ourselves. So when I think about not keeping a record of wrongdoing for yourself, it is letting go of those things that you feel guilty about, letting go of those things that you feel shame about, letting go of those things that you feel bitter about, and letting go of those things that you feel resentful about. So the guilt and the shame, starting with those because those are specifically focused on the things that you feel about yourself. A lot of times we feel guilty about things that we've done in our past, whether they were things that we did against what we morally believe, or whether they were things that we did to maybe hurt someone else even though it was in our best interest. So the first part, when you've done something wrong and it's against your morals, it's something that you don't feel good about, it's something that's not in line with your character, you have to forgive yourself about that. So I'm not going to go super in depth into what forgiveness looks like because I have a whole series about forgiveness a few sessions ago, so definitely check that out. But what I want to focus on here is really talking about letting go of the punishment that you keep putting on yourself. If people feel really guilty about things that they've done in the past, they often don't believe that they deserve good things to come to them. They maybe consciously or unconsciously even act in ways that would suggest that I am not worthy of getting good things from you. I'm not worthy of receiving love from myself, let alone receiving love from someone else. And if you are in a space where you can forgive yourself, it makes it really difficult for you to forgive other people, and you tend to put up with a lot more crap, we'll say, or a lot more things that aren't necessarily what you deserve because you feel like you need to be punished about something probably completely unrelated that you still feel guilty about. So the sooner that you're able to forgive that and say things to yourself like, I know that I did X, Y, and Z, it didn't feel good to do that. It didn't feel good for myself or for the other person. But I'm human, I'm flawed, and I am able to move on from that. I'm able to grow from that. I'm able to make a different decision in the future, and I cannot keep punishing myself for something that I did in the past. And every time those ugly feelings of guilt come up, keep telling yourself that. You don't have to just say it one time and expect yourself to never feel guilty again, but every time you experience a tinge of guilt, let it go, forgive yourself over and over and over again so that you can feel better. You can feel like you deserve people to be good to you, and you can feel like you deserve to be good to yourself. Now, one of the other pieces of guilt is the guilt around doing something for yourself that might hurt someone else. So a prime example of that is if you end a relationship with someone that it's not that the relationship was really bad, but it wasn't necessarily good for you, and the other person is a really good person, but it's not a good relationship for you. You end that, their feelings are hurt, so now you feel guilty. That's a little bit different from the doing something that maybe isn't in line with your morals. This one is often where we're talking about being selfish, right? Like we're talking about being self-centered and taking something for yourself that might end up hurting someone else. And one of the ways that I suggest letting go of that guilt is being able to recognize that you are a priority, and just because it hurts someone else's feelings doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong or that it's a bad thing. It's okay to feel bad about something like that. It's okay to say, I don't want to hurt you. Like, I don't want to hurt someone's feelings. So it makes sense that you would feel bad about it. But if you continue to hold on to it and you continue to beat yourself up over it and continue to punish yourself about it, that is when it shifts into that space of guilt, and it shifts into that long-term guilt that then does not allow you to really be able to receive the things that you deserve, because you're constantly punishing yourself over something that you did in the past that was self-serving and that was a priority for you, but that also hurt someone else. It's okay that someone else's feelings might get hurt when you're thinking about being selfish. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about being considerate and being kind, but that doesn't, just because something might hurt someone else's feelings doesn't necessarily mean that you don't do it. I'm not saying that you go out with the intention of hurting other people, but sometimes in the midst of us taking care of ourselves and deciding that we have to make ourselves a priority, other people's feelings might get hurt. And that is one of the consequences of it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that A, them getting hurt is your fault, or B, you have to sacrifice your sanity and your well-being in order to protect them from getting hurt. The ugly cousin of guilt is often shame, that you've done something that you feel ashamed of, that you know was not good. It's pretty much associated with things that you're like, I feel really guilty about, but I also feel really ashamed of. Again, let that go. Remind yourself that you're human, that you're flawed, that you make mistakes, and allow yourself to move past it. Constantly punishing yourself for something that you've done in the past, and the punishment doesn't necessarily have to be like you give yourself a spanking, or that's generally not what we're talking about when we're talking about punishment. Punishment can come up in a lot of different ways of not allowing yourself to experience happiness, not allowing yourself to experience joy. When you are experiencing those things, telling yourself, why are you experiencing this? You did X, Y, and Z. You shouldn't be feeling this way. Anytime you tell yourself that you shouldn't have something that is good for you, you're punishing yourself for that. Another area that people often feel shamed about is when bad or traumatic things have happened to them that were completely not their fault, completely out of their control. I see a lot of shame around people who experience sexual abuse, or any kind of abuse, honestly, any kind of trauma. They often blame themselves for what happened, and they often feel very ashamed about that. And the way that I talk to people about letting go of that is, first and foremost, reminding yourself that what someone did to hurt you in that way is not your fault. Even when we're not talking about like trauma, there are lots of things that happen in relationships where people blame themselves, where women in particular blame themselves, that if I had just been a better girlfriend or been a better wife, then so and so wouldn't have cheated on me. Like, all of those things that come up related to other people's behaviors and how we take that responsibility on, you have to remind yourself that you can't control other people. Sometimes that's really difficult for us to grasp and difficult to understand, but a lot of times we interpret other people's behavior in a way that suggests that we can control it, and so we take on the responsibility and the ownership. We keep a record of that wrong. We take that ownership of what they did as if it was something that we should have done differently. And again, like I said, if you're telling yourself what you should or should not have done, you're probably going down the wrong path anyway. So when you're experiencing shame around something that someone else has done to you, release that by remembering that it's not your fault, that it wasn't something that you could control. You cannot control other people. And then remembering to show compassion to yourself and kindness to yourself around those things. So constantly telling yourself that you are a good person, that you're worthy, that you're deserving. That compassion piece plays a really big role to counteract shame, and I'll talk a little bit more about compassion in just a couple of minutes. So back to the keeping no record of wrongdoing. To avoid shame, to avoid guilt, to avoid bitterness, to avoid resentment, is that you don't keep piling those things up. You do not keep record of the times where you hurt someone, or the times where you did something that was not in line with your character, or the time that someone else did something to hurt you. Keeping record of those things, keeping track of them, keeping this long laundry list of all the things that you feel like you've done wrong or that you've done bad to other people, it just gets longer and longer and longer. And that is when the weight and the heaviness of the guilt and the shame and the bitterness and the resentment, it piles up. So you want to just start, in theory, erasing things off the list. This is not to say that you forget the things that you did. This is not to say that you just continue to engage in the behaviors because you wiped it off your list, so now you can just keep adding other things onto the pile. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you recognize what you've done. You recognize what it is. If it's in that category of I'm doing something out of line with my character, then you make a change and you say, you know, that's not necessarily me. I want to do X, Y, and Z different. If it's something that you're making a decision for yourself and it ends up hurting someone else, recognize that that is okay. Like, sometimes that happens and that is also okay, and it's not something that you need to keeping a record of. If it's related to other people and the things that they're doing to you, again, removing that stuff off the list. Yes, they hurt you. Yes, that sucks. Yes, it hurts, but you don't want to keep throwing it back at them. You don't want to keep going back to that place. Sometimes it does take forgiveness. Sometimes it can be reconciled. That's not always the case, but sometimes it can be. And whatever path that you need to take with that other person to resolve it, do that. But do not keep a list every time someone does something to you. You're going back to 10 years ago saying, well, remember when you did this, this, and this. This is the same as you doing this, this, and this. You want to let go of the record. You want to let go of the list so that you can relieve the guilt. You can relieve the shame, the bitterness, and the resentment, so that you can practice loving yourself more. So, love is keeping no record of wrongdoing. Now, I want to switch into, because I think that in order for you to practice not keeping a record of wrongdoing and not holding all of these things over your head, you also have to practice patience and kindness, which I just want to lump into compassion. Being compassionate with yourself, being patient with yourself, being kind to yourself is probably one of the highest goals that you can strive towards in terms of loving yourself. Being compassionate is not saying I'm perfect. It's not saying that I've never done anything wrong. It's not saying that I am not flawed. It's actually acknowledging that you are imperfect, that you are flawed, that you have made mistakes, and so has everyone else in the world. It's acknowledging that you can mess up and you can have a wrong, but that you can forgive yourself and you can give yourself permission to make those mistakes and to do something different in the future. Compassion is saying, you know what? you are a human being. You have flaws. You make mistakes, but I still love you anyway, and I still find value anyway. Being compassionate is knowing what your value is. Being compassionate is being able to recognize every time you have something negative to say to yourself, every time a negative thought pops up, you also have a way of being more compassionate. One of the ways that we teach people about compassion is we have them picture either their younger self or a child that they're taking care of. And that child or that younger person doing something similar to what they're doing, what they're beating themselves up about, thinking about that child and how they would respond to that child. So I love doing inner child work. I love talking about, tell me what age you were when this happened, and how would you talk to the younger you? How would you talk to yourself at that age? And generally speaking, we are a lot more compassionate with a child, with a friend, maybe even with an elderly person than we would be with ourselves. So I want you to think about that same compassion, that same patience, that same kindness that you would show towards a child, that you would show towards a friend, and reflect that on yourself. The more you're able to do that, the more you're able to focus on being compassionate with yourself, the more you're going to practice loving yourself, and the more you're going to practice being able to get the things that you deserve, being able to show people your worth and your value, and be okay with receiving that. So I have so much more that I want to say, but I'm going to end it there for today. And we are going to come back and keep talking about 1 Corinthians 13 and how that can be applied to loving yourself. So make sure that you go out this week and do something to be selfish for you and practice loving yourself. See y'all next week.